Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. So I know all of you have been itching for an SJM update, and we have some new information and some interesting things that have been going around, bubbling underneath the surface, namely with what's going on with the CCTVs that we're still trying to get released. What has SJM's father been up to? What's going on with a lawsuit that Mr. A had been in the middle of? And an interesting new theory that sort of ties everything a bit clearer together. So SJM's father, who has been through this horrible ordeal for over a year now, had been documenting his thoughts and sharing with us the details of the progress of what's been going on with the investigation, how he's been feeling, but he hasn't been blogging as of late very frequently. His last post was back at the early first week of April 7th. And in that blog post, he said that he had just had a hearing about his suit for releasing public information, which is essentially his request to get the CCTV tapes opened. The CCTV tapes that are from the PAWPAW Bridge and the Olympic Expressway that have closer detail and would basically solve the case on the riverbank. He said that the judge at that point had been changed and that a ruling is expected in June. So we're basically coming up on June now. And that was where he left it. And I kind of think that he's not updating his blog as much because once you're involved in these lawsuits, your days turn into essentially each court date. So he posted after his court date. No matter how you try to parse it out, the next day in your mind is how your fate is being decided at the next court date. So I'm perhaps just surmising that he's probably kind of like in that Lululand of just not sensing time anymore. And that's how like time can just pass whenever you're involved in like these lawsuits. But we did see him come out to a 1-year anniversary of the tragic demise of his son. That was on May 23rd. We'll get into that. But what has the mainstream media been saying? Not much, but this is what they had to say. They released this report saying like, oh, 1 year on from the tragic SJM case, we have now quadrupled the number of CCTV cameras on the PAWPAW River Park area, some of them being high definition enough to read what's on a sign that the reporter was holding, also the logo of her company jacket. But again, that's not the point. We don't want to have the focus be on, what are all these new CCTV cameras doing when basically the old ones worked just fine and we just need those released. See, I'm like kind of misdirecting. They said that the cameras have gone from 137 to 567 cameras at a cost of about $3.5 million. Again, that's not the issue. We want the old tapes that came from the 135 cameras that didn't cost $3.5 million to produce. They said that they also installed an AI system to detect if there was any kind of suspicious motions, but especially on the bridge. But again, that's not the issue here. That is a good development to help people from, making an unfortunate last choice and deal with some of their staff shortfalls. But again, all those details, not the main point. We just want the CCTV footage that the cameras already collected from a year ago on those cameras, still not giving it to us. Then they said that there's, this big old debate of whether to install a safety fence that would block access to the river because of this event. Again, that's not the main issue. We just want the CCTV of that incident. It's not the river that made this tragedy. It was some person that made something else happen that we're trying to solve. And then they're like, oh, and there's a debate of whether or not to ban alcohol at the river. So again, all of these issues, not the main issue. We just want to have the CCTV camera footage from last year from the missing cameras. And these cameras where their story continues to change. So one of the cameras in question are coming from this area where it would have a closer view of the riverside. But the police at the time said that, oh, those cameras are broken. But yet, on the day that the body was discovered on April 30th, there was footage of the rescue mission from those cameras. So what is the true story? Are they broken or are they not? And then even remember from the unanswered questions episode, the footage that they used as B-roll, as like kind of general surveillance shots of the river bank, the river park, came from cameras that previously the police had claimed were broken. So how were they broken, but yet the footage was sent over to Hot Daddy's show and he was able to use that in his program? How were these CCTV cameras broken, but yet like a few days after the incident, they were suddenly working again to document the amazing police work of retrieving the body from the river and having that all documented in a really nice far shot? It doesn't add up, does it? So there was an outdoor music concert about a week ago where Mr. Son appeared as the guest of honor, and in it he did seem like he was in much better health, and he seemed more like resolute, principled, kind of like determined, because he said that he couldn't have made it through the entire year without the support of all the people who have been interested in this case and have sent him messages and have really fought on the side of justice. And he says that he doesn't know how far it can go, but he's going to take it all the way. And now he is not parsing, mincing any kind of words. He is really directing the focus and attention, saying like, look, I know Mr. A knows more, and the CCTV cameras can show it to us, and yet this is where I'm continuously being blocked. He said that yes, from this case we can see what a joke the Blue House petition and the National Assembly petitions are, because nothing really came about from them. So some of you were asking in some of the comments like, well, if the Blue House petition was successful, you know, where there was like so many signatures, and also the National Assembly petition was successful with so many signatures, it crossed all of the barriers, isn't the government forced to act? They're forced to respond, and that is an action, but they're not forced to actually take the action that the petition wants. And so, of course, in this case was a forensic scientific-based investigation, or at least the release of the CCTV tapes. Immediately after the Blue House petition had gone through, the Blue House made a response, and that was under President Moon Jae-in, and they basically said like, oh, we trust everything that happened in the police investigation. We echo the sentiments and the opinions and the analysis of the police. So basically they had just immediately rubber stamped whatever the police said what they were going to do. And remember how shady that was. The National Assembly petition, that petition basically is a way to try to, I guess in theory it sounds pretty good, to have like a citizen-based appeal to move a government agency in a certain direction. But the petition did go through, and that petition goes to a committee, and the committee's only responsibility up until that point for action is like, okay, should we or should we not send this on to a vote to the General National Assembly? And if they approve, then we can get an agency that we think is appropriate or basically what the petition is also requesting, to move on behalf of this investigation so it's like outside of the police, or essentially to force the hands of the government agencies to release the CCTV tapes. That didn't go anywhere. I don't know if it's dead in committee, but definitely we've had a lot of other things going on in the country to I guess, give politicians an excuse of why they couldn't act on it. And so that has not moved forward either. Now, Mr. Son said that, now this is the whole drop the mic moment. In his speech in front of his supporters and the crowd and to the public via social media, he said if the investigation had started right away on that first day, Mr. A would have been required to bring in his shoes and clothes before he had a chance to throw them away. So basically, first off, right off the bat, he's saying like, I know, I see, j'accuse. And so that was really suspicious in the sense that, like, sure, maybe you could buy the excuse that, like, oh, it got so dirty. But how did it get dirty, Mr. A? But let's just say legitimately the clothes and the shoes got dirty and they just wanted to throw away because they're just a fancy family. The police's response is what was so suspect. Like, the action itself, sure, was suspect, but the police response, if you guys remember, they were saying like, oh, it's no big deal. Like, why does something like that, which is such a huge red flag, become not an issue and something that they can kind of readily accept and that they're trying to kind of gloss over? Remember, even the socks that were in the backpack that they finally did submit, they said like, oh, these weren't the socks that Mr. A was wearing that night, but they were just in his backpack as an extra pair. I don't know, like what kind, like what's the last grade that you were in when you packed in an extra pair of socks? Probably the same age when you packed in an extra pair of underwear when you might not have been able to control your bladder and you went pee-pee, and the kindergarten asks all the parents to always pack an extra pair of underwear for the kids. I don't know who does that. And then they were fine with him submitting all of this evidence weeks late after he had gone to the dry cleaner to clean up everything off of the clothes that they did submit. Remember? So now we're just going to walk through this and go through a little bit some of memory lane, because we have to remember how suspicious all of this still is to this day. Now, Mr. Son also did say, this case sends the message to society that we better be careful that nothing like this happens to us, because there will be no one there to protect you, save you, or fight for the side of justice. And again, that is something that you feel and think and live and breathe in a thug society, a fascist society, a place where totalitarianism rules the day and you cannot trust the people that you're supposed to trust. Mr. Son went on and said, like, there was no concern with solving how SJM got into the water and drowned. They were just hell-bent on concluding that there was no criminal activity involved. They said that there was no relevance to the wounds on the head. Again, any investigator would see that this is extremely suspicious. And then the criminal profilers that they profiled on the show, the documentary show, and are people who actually, like in other cases, have really, really high standing and high reputation within Korea and generally seem rational. Like, these aren't, even in the Eun-hae case, the Black Widow case, the same faces I told you appeared, all the profilers saying, you know, like explaining the investigation and like going through the evidence, they seem like, in those kind of circumstances where maybe there's no corruption of opinion, very professional, skilled, know what they're doing. That's why this seems even scarier. For the right price, under the right circumstances, or under the right political pressure, the people that we trust, the ones that actually are good and have like built up a solid reputation, will follow along. And so Any investigator, like we said, will immediately suspect the last person seen with SJM alive. That's Mr. A. And then they would also conclude that this was extremely odd, that there were some very deep wounds in the body, the head in particular, of SJM. But even before the autopsy was conducted, and I believe even before the body even went to the morgue, like, you know, when the media were asking the police about, like, okay, what was the state of the body at when the, you know, when SJM got out of the water, and they said, like, oh, well, you know, these are just scratches. These scratches were not scratches on the head. Remember, now that we saw the photos, they were deep wounds and gashes, and they had said, like, oh, it's just from the body moving around and bumping up against the rocks for a few days, and that's what it was. But before any kind of forensic investigation, they had released it to the police, and then when journalists were trying to figure out who was it that said it to the police would not say, like, who made that announcement. And had that been the case, shouldn't there have been more surface abrasions if it had really been floating around for days enough to get the wounds of that nature? Because those were, like, very, like, specific wounds. Shouldn't there be a lot more scratches and abrasions? Because remember, SJM's dad said, like, he was surprised at how well preserved his son looked after he had seen him. And shouldn't have his clothes been more, like, you know, ripped apart by the tides? And again, remember, in that part of the Han River, it's basically like still water, and there are really no currents, so it didn't go around. They had basically said, like, oh, it went all the way around, like it took a loop-de-loop, you know, like on a Han River cruise, and then suddenly just plopped right there, right where it began. I mean, the leaps of faith that they basically had just put in the official documents and reports are astounding, and I don't think would even pass their own test. And speaking of that report, remember the police report that we got? It was just a mid-investigation police report. They did not even file a final report. And remember again how shady the actions were when they made the press conference in front of the entire nation about the findings of the mid-investigation police report. It came about not even a month after the incident, maybe about 3.5 weeks, and it was in front of the press, but without SJM's family. Because why? Where was SJM's family? They did not even know about this press conference for the mid-investigation police report. In fact, they had been lured into the police station to finally get a look at the CCTV coverage, and Mr. Son said that they gave it to him on the shakiest, like, oldest TV that was connected improperly, and they were stuck there, right? They had no idea this was going on. Meanwhile, in another police, I think in the main police headquarters in, like, north of Seoul, because they were south of Seoul, they were doing the press conference and controlling the narrative. So that has been a key recurrence here. How much one side, and it seems as if there's kind of like a coordinated control of the narrative. And so they were controlling the narrative. They put out all of these, like, red herrings and kind of like circumstantial assumptions. Remember the fake fishermen who are also key to their theory that SJM just walked into the river, like, at some absurd time that did not match up in the timelines after the fact. And they did not have the family there, obviously, to present a rebutting argument or to present even, like, a visual of, like, how they would respond facially to listening to the items in the mid-investigation police report. So again, super shady. Now let's move on to the CCTV request that SJM's father had made. He said last fall he was requesting access to the CCTV from the PAWPAW Bridge and the Olympic Expressway. So those are the cameras that are angled from the opposite view of what we have been parsing together, like zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. That comes from the entrance of the park that's facing the water. Now, these other cameras are coming in the other direction and facing the riverbank. So they would show a lot more of like what went on from the other side. And so he said that they had denied his request back then and said that it was not possible. But then after he filed that lawsuit, right, to get access to the CCTV cameras, and then after that, he heard that they said, "Oh, we're sorry, but the CCTV footage has now been deleted." Now, whether that's 100% true or not, whether they're still floating out there, we don't know. But their stance was to him that, "Oh, sorry, it's gone anyway." And he said that this is super sus because if it had happened before he filed his lawsuit, then most likely he's saying that the police were preparing themselves for the instance that in the lawsuit, if the judge had asked for the release of the CCTV tapes, they would be able to say, "Oops, sorry, we deleted it." If it were not that case and they deleted it after he filed the lawsuit, then that looks like destruction of evidence. Either way, he says that this is completely corrupt. And remember, the police were getting heat and they wanted to make it seem as if they were not being biased and corrupt. So they created this like panel of so-called outside experts, but they were just appointees that were friendly to them. They were supposed to take about like 10 days or 2 weeks to go over the evidence, to go over the mid-investigation police report and submit their opinion. And it wasn't even like 24 to 36 hours where they were like, "Oops, nope, we're all done. We've already concluded. Nope, we just agree with whatever the police had just said." So it was as if they did not want to look more into the evidence, because the more you look, the more you see that there at least is more to investigate, not to quickly conclude and then leave the actual investigation hanging. Because what was the conclusion? The conclusion was exonerating Mr. A, but yet that wasn't the issue. It was more about just what happened to SJM. But you see, if what happened to SJM had something to do with Mr. A and the goal is to exonerate Mr. A, you never want to answer the question of what really happened to SJM. Because remember, even in that police report, how aggressive it sounded, as if it came from Mr. A's defense lawyer's office. And one of the big contentions I had was in the appendices, where they said that, and this was supposed to be the police making these positions, saying that like, "Oh, well, we're not really so sure whether we can believe SJM's father's claim that his son did not like the water," because again, they were basically trying to say that SJM wanted to take a swim at like 4:20 in the morning in freezing cold, dirty river water, which I said, was like full of Viagra too. And they based their claim off of some photos and videos they suddenly discovered. Guess who? I wonder who gave it to them. But we have seen some of these photos where, in particular, SJM is at the beach with his friends, and then he is taking a group picture basically on the wet part of the sand where the waves come in. He has his shoes on. These are like running shoes. And the rest of his friends are like barefoot. They're, about to go in the water. They're going to play in the water. But they're saying like, "Oh, look, he likes to be in the water." Look, if your friends have all come to the ocean and basically they're saying, "We're going to take a picture," and like you want to show the ocean behind you, then yeah, SJM was probably obligated to go, really quick and take a photo, and then you're probably going to leave and go back, and chill by, the picnic basket or whatever. That kind of leap of logic and trying to like squeeze as if the police were the criminals, like trying to like, make up claims. that really started to get on my nerves because it really seemed like it was like kind of like a childish liar. And I was like, how can this be the police department doing this kind of crazy antics? Well, in the meantime, apparently, there was that, and there was that whole like aggressive legal campaign by Mr. A's family out to sue everybody. But I guess they had focused on a few particular people, and there was one journalist where they recently announced this week that Mr. A's family had dropped the lawsuit because I guess the journalist had made a public apology. So I don't know exactly how to read this, whether it's capitulation by the journalist and they thought they kind of won, whether it was the journalist also saying like, okay, I don't want to deal with this, or whether, they can see like if they keep pressing this, they're going to bring more attention again to themselves on this case, and it's not going to look good for Mr. A, because in the court of public opinion, I don't think that people think that they know this doesn't smell right. So the more that they do that, the less they get. And so I guess that was probably some compromise that they had made, but that still goes to show you that, like, they're still kind of like, look, so their position, Mr. A's family's position, like, look, everything is fine because the police have investigated and that's what they concluded, and so why is all of this out here? And that's their position, but we're just saying that there is a position by SJM's father that is not dying down, and he's out there continuously reminding us of his position and how dangerous this is to society. On the case of the whole police versus prosecution reform and whether the police should have more investigative rights, SJM's father said that, look, for most people in Korea and probably around the world, you'll never come across the police in this situation. You'll never come across prosecutors in this situation. Whether it's the prosecutors or the police that win and have more investigative powers, for the ordinary person, it doesn't affect their lives. They're just thinking about like getting a promotion and paying fewer taxes, he says. So he understands how people would think like this doesn't have any effect on my life. But he said that he had a huge eureka moment by going through this case. That people with what he considers, how the police investigated this situation is very understandable, how they did not have abilities. They just did not have a strong enough set of tools or maybe ethics, or just, he said, like, people like that should not have that much power. And so he's saying that that's what he realized, that people who have that power and have that sort of, he called it kind of ability or capacity, but basically I think he was also saying kind of like a moral code, is dangerous because there's nothing that the citizens can do about it. There's nothing that we can say about it, and there's no real comfortable way to trust how much you should trust the police in that case. So if they're going to just go to the highest bidder and you're not exactly sure if that's what's going on here, then how do you know how much to trust the police? How much do you know how much you can trust the system? Because remember, in the whole month of May, while they were doing the investigation, the police kept saying to like Mr. Son, hey, we got this covered. We're going to find out the truth about your son. All the while, it looks like they were conspiring behind the scenes to then, prematurely release their mid-investigation police report that completely just focused on exonerating Mr. A, and then coordinating on the same weekend, it looks like, to have the release of unanswered questions that really skewed this fake reenactment that aligned with the police report almost exactly, although there was mistakes there too. It looks like that like the producers didn't get the final draft of the mid-investigation police report, but for the most part, it had matched up. And so their findings were like consistent in this false narrative, again, controlling the narrative. So it looked like it was a 1-2 punch, kind of contain the SJM family, make sure that they were limited from the public view, and then blast this narrative out there. Remember, there was the fake father of Mr. A also featured prominently with deceptive like subtitles. I asked Korean people, I was like, yeah, who did you think that man that was mosaicked out speaking on behalf of Mr. A's family was? And they're like, yeah, it's like the dad or something. I was like, no, it just said like some family member, but it was like flashed so fast that, you would have missed it. Okay, so what is the new piece of information or theory that I came across that people are now, again, after analyzing the CCTV footage that we do have, that creates a bit of a clearer picture on what perhaps happened? So there has been a whole question in people's minds. When was the last time SJM was actually like alert, conscious, and essentially kind of like not a vegetable? Because we saw him slumped over in the 2:18 a.m. picture. And for a lot of people, they think that's the last time. That is the last time that he probably was seen and did not wake up after then. From one of the witnesses in the mid-investigation police report saying that, they saw both of them sitting. But at that time, there was a photo taken and SJM wasn't even in the picture. It was just Mr. A standing, talking on the phone. Total luck at how that picture and all that timeline had matched up. But how, if indeed it was 2:18 a.m. and he was slumped over and he had never woken up after that, because there were other reports from eyewitness accounts that Mr. A had tried to wake him up and then even tried to lift him up, but then that SJM had just slumped back down without any response. So if you were conscious, at least, if you're kind of drunk, like if you kind of fall back down, like there is some sort of motor response. They said there was absolutely no motor response. But if that were the case, how did he get into that state? Now, aside from perhaps, people are like, what was in that condition bottle that, that energy drink bottle that Mr. A didn't pay for, which a lot of people are saying like, maybe he had, carried or had bought from somebody that wasn't really energy drink. But aside from that, because people are just saying like, there was no way for that amount of alcohol in that short period of time, with the way that we saw that the pace that SJM was drinking, for him to get that drunk where he was basically like slumped over. Well, 1:49 a.m. That is the new analysis of this CCTV footage that I found. And right before, we have extensive video of what happened basically precisely seconds before the 1:49 critical moment. So remember when Mr. A had gone up into the tree, like SJM was filming, Mr. A doing his like antics, and maybe it was probably because he was trying to say, Mr. A, keep your distance. So Mr. A was in the tree, and then he started running around, and then he started doing his dance, and then he started looking at his phone, and then SJM was yelling out to him saying like, hey dude, all right, just get that, crazy thought out of your mind. Crazy thought, a lot of people are surmising like what that crazy thought might have been, and then come back to the picnic mat. So we saw that interchange, but we did not see exactly like then what happened when Mr. A got back to the picnic mat. Well, that is what the new CCTV footage analysis shows, where it looks like, and you can tell because Mr. A was wearing this blinding white long t-shirt, And you can see it in the images, and you can also see how SJM had the black pants on and then the black and white striped shirt. So his shirt comes off as sort of like black and white or gray. And it looks like that Mr. A had rammed in with force into SJM. He maybe even used his left arm to punch the right side of SJM's cheek and then falls over the riverbank. With such force, it happened so quickly. Even one of the witnesses said that they saw like him fall back. Now, in the statement that Mr. A, remember, made to police, even though he said he was like blackout drunk, couldn't remember anything, but then he's like, oh, I remember this part. And he said that, oh, SJM was running around, then he tripped and fell over the riverbank, and that's when I had to drag him up. Now, it looks like, actually, no, it was Mr. A that was running around, either like punched, bumped, shoved, like in anger probably, because he's been, rebuffed, or SJM, he didn't like what SJM had said, and that moment might be actually the time when SJM had really fallen down while he was conscious, and then may perhaps hit his head on the rocks, because then we also see that Mr. A had carried SJM on his back up the hill and put him most likely in a different area of away from the picnic mat, because that 2:18 a.m. picture shows like no picnic mat. People are just like, that's kind of weird, like where'd the picnic mat go? And now that they've lined up the photos, they're showing that it's about 10 meters away from where they had the picnic mat. And again, that also then now explains like why there was a discrepancy in the location and the placement of the two and their picnic mat in the police report, because people were saying like, no, like, why does the police report say that they were across the two little storm drain gullies when they were actually on the other side of the two? Well, probably because they were in both places. The picnic mat was there, and then when he had dragged him back up, and then where the 2:18 a.m. photo was over in the other location. And the reason why we also saw this is that, remember, there was that witness who was just like, look, I'm going to stand here for like 30 minutes as if he's like a Karen or something, because nobody does that kind of a thing, like standing there like this staring. Because he said that he thought he saw something lewd going on, something shady, and that he wanted to make sure that everything was okay. This witness said that, remember, it looked like Mr. A was like laying next to SJM and digging his hands in his pockets and trying to look for something, but, also digging your hands, looking for something. How many times do you have to dig your hands to look for something, right? He might have been just trying to be polite about like what it means to dig your hands down someone's pants. And so that was the time frame where they were taking the photo, and so then that explains to me a lot of like what had happened, because then it seems as if like through this whole time, even in Mr. A's testimony, saying like, oh, he was trying to wake him up, but he wouldn't wake up. Now, how does this combine with the 3:31 pushover video? From that video, we were all trying to see like what kind of situation could the two have been in? Was SJM awake? Did he suddenly awake and then did he get pushed over? Remember, in some of the simulations, they were showing that actually the position of the first one to go over had to have been more of like crouched down. It wasn't like a fully prone, stood up person that got pushed. It just didn't match the height. Now it looks like to me, when after the 2:18 a.m. where it looks like, Mr. A's on the phone doing all sorts of things. Some people are saying he's like deleting stuff. Other people saying like he's like messaging people. In any event, he needs help. Something's happened to his friend, and it looks like they were trying to revive him. It didn't work. Remember, during this time, they said that, he was trying to bring him up, bring SJM up and then he just kind of fell back over, bring him up, fell back over. Maybe that's when somebody said like, oh yeah, I think I saw two people sitting up together, where they were. But no, he was just trying to revive him. What it looks like to me is that he finally gave up. A decision was made to then why don't we just send SJM down the river? And at 3:31 a.m., I think that's when that was the decision to just, as if they're throwing out trash, not necessarily kind of like a push, like a fight. I think that fight happened probably at 1:49 a.m. and that he was trying to solve the situation until 3:31, where he just basically like, all right, well, it looks like he's not coming back. Looks like there's a watery garbage disposal there. And so it looks like he was kind of like, as if you're like throwing a sack of potatoes and then just like going down after it. That's what it seems like to me now. And it seems like it connects the dots in terms of like action reaction with the way that the two guys were interacting, and how like SJM seemed to have gotten fed up, and then as Mr. A looks like he had lost it, and then something happened. So I think in that sense, it makes it a lot clearer. Now there are some other, people saying that there could have been a Mr. B, because it looked like there was another person there with them. And for the longest time, like, that had been kind of like this debated back and forth theory. We don't know. That's what the CCTV would show, but I wouldn't be surprised. The reason why I wouldn't be surprised is that this now seems like, when you compare it to the Eun Hae case, where it seems like she has no connections and no leverage and nothing, and though everybody's just going after her, this one seems like it was shut down, and shut down quick. And yes, Mr. A comes from a very privileged background, and we have surmised why his family may be in an ideal position to have been able to quickly make some calls or pull some strings. But I also wouldn't be surprised if that was also added to the fact that if there was a Mr. B, that Mr. B also could have been even more VIP, or his father or his family were more VIP than Mr. A. Because I've seen from a personal story where there was like a group, and I think I've told you guys this before, but there was like some shady director I had to work with once. I was like, why do I have to work with this director? Like, he doesn't even know what he's doing. Like, why is this basically this investor so like enamored with this guy? Well, it turns out because he was friends with one of a former president's son. And so that group, where like a father was like a minister of something and a different father was like a judge or a prosecutor or something, they all got in trouble for something. And the only one to get in trouble, and I think even had to like go to jail, was the director guy that didn't have the fancy father. And so I would not be surprised if Mr. A could have been friends with a Mr. B in a situation that was so high level, where Mr. A is kind of the one getting the hit or taking the brunt of it, and being told like, look, you take the brunt of it, we'll protect you, and you'll be fine, just take one for the team. On the other hand, even if there were no Mr. B, should have been a much more thorough investigation. And it's very clear that at least a thorough investigation was not had in this case, and could be resolved with existing CCTV footage that had been recorded and had been promised to be released to the media, but then at the last minute had been taken away and been sequestered into some archive. mysteriously. And that is even what the public official who was like, oh, wait, I thought I was supposed to give this to you, had mentioned to those reporters. All these questions that are unanswered should have been put through a real forensics investigation. I mean, was that white pillow really like a handkerchief put there to absorb a bleeding wound? It certainly looks possible. Definitely. And remember, we even did have a blood trail throughout the park, and then the police said that it was just cat blood. I don't know. Do cats go on a period or something? Because I don't think that that was cat blood. So again, in June, we should have some sort of decision on the CCTV, it seems, at least that petition, even though they said that it's like deleted now. And the prosecution, because remember, SJM's father had said he's going to take that option of submitting his appeal to the prosecution, and it seems as if the prosecution has been investigating, because in his blog post he said that the prosecution may have a final conclusion, but whether that is a conclusion to investigate or they have all investigated and they're concluding, that remains a question. But in any event, this case has been far from over from the one they just tried to wrap it up in the first like 3.5 weeks, which made no sense. And then they were already doing the documentary of it. Again, that made no sense. That also signaled, wow, that there is something going on here. So, what do you guys think? I mean, still, it shocks me. And then the more that we just kind of remember, like, that was shady, that was shady, that was shady. And not even like Mr. A being shady, the police department being shady. I mean, yes, like those antics of Mr. A, like, you know, could have been an accident, could have been whatever. And they were just trying to, like, you know, put up their best defense, let's say. But that's shady. But what was shadier was more of like the police's response, because it looked like they were literally like the co-workers. Something. Anyhow, put your comments below. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And hope you have a good week, you guys. Bye-bye.
Tune in next time. Don't forget to subscribe. Find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Love you.